Well, why don't we get started? If you guys can introduce yourself and tell us about tonight and what we can expect, that'd be great.
Happy to. So my name is Emily Ennis from Ennis Associates. I'm the lead consultant working with the town on a double effort. One is to evaluate the town's readiness for compliance with the MBTA Communities Act, and then help the town develop zoning that is in compliance with the act. But the broader project is to help the town do a review of its zoning bylaws, look at previous plans and what those plans have suggested in terms of zoning recommendations, and come forward with proposals to address previous recommendations, but also things that have come out of this planning process that should be changed. So as part of that, we've got some public engagement efforts. We've already done one public meeting in addition to a meeting with town staff. We're looking at doing another public meeting in early winter. We're also reaching out to other boards and committees, yourselves being one of them, to talk about your experience with the zoning bylaws and what you think could be changed or should be changed, or maybe should it be changed. I'll also be talking with your building inspector, interviewing him as well for his experience with the zoning code. So what I was hoping for tonight, I mean, I do have information that I can present. I've got a presentation on the MBTA Communities Act. I have the list of the information that we've pulled together so far from the previous planning efforts. We're also going through, my team and I, the zoning to see, are there incorrect references here, typos there, things like that that could be cleaned up. But maybe I'd like to start tonight with just your experience with the zoning bylaws, hear from you a little bit about, your role, the types of variances that have come from you, your thoughts on that, and then we can move from that conversation into more specifics about either of the two processes, and then I'm happy to share the other pieces that I have.
Okay, and well, just by way of introductions, I'm Rich Benevento. I've been on the ZBA now a couple of years, I think. And Anne, you want to introduce Anne LeBlanc Snyder? Want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Anne LeBlanc Snyder. I am one of the alternates. I have been on the board for many years. I've forgotten how many. But yeah, so thank you for coming tonight. This is exciting to hear about.
And Anne's background is in architecture. Is that right, Anne?
Yes, I'm an architect. I oversaw construction for 20 years. Now I sell real estate. Seem to be linked, but yeah, that's about me in a nutshell.
And
Great.
my background is highway and traffic engineering. So, and then we also have Ann Cody. Ann, want to introduce yourself? Okay, I think Ann's having a little trouble with her audio, but I see that Craig Hartwell just joined. Craig, we're just introducing ourselves. Want to introduce yourself and how long you've been on the board and what your background is?
Hi, my name's Craig, and I've been on the board since 2006.
Okay. Emily, Craig, before you go on, Emily, we just wanted to get our perspective on the zoning bylaws and what we see for special permits and variances and things like that. And just to kind of get a sense of how we view the document that we have to abide by and follow and help people be in compliance with. So I think Anne and Craig have been on a little bit longer than I have, so they've seen a lot over the many years. I'll just give my perspective. We're seeing projects come before us now that we're trying to fit within the fabric of the community. Projects that I think the way we look at them, particularly the big one that's in front of us right now, is the Angelicas project. And that, that being how do we keep a project to fit within the character of the community? How do we mitigate the impacts, whether they're environmental impacts, traffic impacts, all of those sorts of things. Oftentimes we will refer back to the bylaws relative to those things, but we're seeing a lot of, and I can speak for myself, but I obviously want to hear from the other members. But for example, the town of Middleton has an adopted complete streets policy.
Mhm.
They have accepted funding based on that policy from the state. Do our bylaws, do they coincide with what the provisions of the complete streets policy require the town to do? And granted, complete street policies with those particularly, you try and comply to the greatest extent practicable. But
Mhm.
do we have the ability to, say, for example, when a developer is doing a project, to make sure he or she is accommodating all users, not just vehicles, but pedestrians and cyclists and their transit? We talked about the MBTA Community Act, right? So what are we doing in terms of providing public transportation and those sorts of things? So I think there's a lot of issues and challenges, I should say, being a better word, when we're reviewing projects. But I think it'd be important to hear from some of the other members. And I don't know what, Anne LeBlanc, you want to talk a little bit about some of the things that you've seen over the years and
I think it's a good time that we're talking about this, because I think as the town is growing and we're working with a set of standards and rules that maybe were established 20, 30 years ago. And I think we're being faced with having to deal with that. And there's really aren't always answers in our bylaws, or they're not clear. And sorry, my dog is barking. So it's good that we've begun the process, or it has begun. So I look forward to hearing recommendations and suggestions for updating the system, because we're no longer a town with more cows than people.
Can
So,
I ask, what are you in particular seeing that feels outdated to you, or that's missing from the bylaws in terms of the projects that you're addressing or would like to consider?
as Rich mentioned, the Angelicus project,
Mhm.
we're not equipped yet entirely for that project, and it makes it difficult. So there's so many variables in the project now, because it's not all spelled out what can and cannot be done. So it's open to interpretation, and I find that difficult. I also find years ago, developers came in and they kind of had carte blanche, and they built some beautiful developments, but they're all 2-acre minimum or 1-acre minimum for the most part, depending on where we are. And I think that needs to be addressed, because I'm sort of a proponent of the MBTA plan, and we need to have some smaller houses be a viable project in town, with smaller homes, and not necessarily condos, maybe cluster developments with single family homes. And we don't have any of that, and we don't really accommodate that. We have a couple of small neighborhoods downtown, in the downtown area along 114 and 62, that have some small compact neighborhoods, but for the most part, we don't have that anywhere. We're dealing with the old rural 1-acre minimum septic systems, and it's just, I think it's time for some change. That's just my opinion, but I see a need that's not necessarily a 4 and 5 bedroom, 4,000 square foot center entrance colonial anymore. I'm the tail end of the baby boomers, and my kids are out of the house, and we have nowhere to go there. And I hear that refrain all the time. And I think part of that is our zoning bylaws restrict a lot of small development in town.
That's helpful
I
to hear. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Rich.
was just saying, Ian, Cody, have you been able to get your audio? You there? Your iPhone is actually on mute. If you try and maybe if you unmute your iPhone. All right, she's not yet. Okay, I just got something in the chat. Craig, why don't we go to you?
What would you like from me?
Well, Emily was looking for just, your views on the bylaws and what we see for variances and what we see for special permits, and do the two coincide, and do you see change that is needed and kind of where? Did I sum that up, Emily, for you?
Yes, pretty much.
Okay.
Basically, what barriers or what opportunities are you seeing with the zoning bylaws based on your experience and what you're thinking of in terms of ways to address them? And then happy to just continue this conversation for a while.
Um, I was under the impression this was a presentation, so I was waiting for that. I'm agnostic. I don't have an opinion. I'm just here to hear the professional give a presentation on what they see is flawed in our bylaws and how we can address them. Because I haven't, we have bylaw review committees, and I've been on those and we've addressed it there, but I certainly I'm not really prepared to make a statement on that right now.
You came in sort of after I gave my initial spiel, which is just fine. I do have information that I could present. Happy to on both the elements of the overall zoning bylaw review and what we have pulled from other planning documents, including the original bylaw review. And also I have a presentation on the MBTA Communities Act. I'm happy to talk about where we are and what we've looked at on that. But I thought it'd be interesting to start out based on all of your experiences as members of the ZBA with what you've found just through your ongoing work as members. So, but I'm happy to transition to that after we hear from everyone else.
Okay. We'll try once more, see if Ann can jump on. She's been trying. So Emily, why don't we just, Ann, if you get on, just belt it out and we'll know that you're there and we'll go to you. But in the meantime, Emily, why don't you just kind of go through your presentation? I think to Craig's point, that would be helpful just to talk a little bit about what you've seen thus far, what the MBTA Act is all about, and what we can expect, and what we should be planning for.
Great, I'm happy to do that. The first thing I'm going to share is the zoning review table that we drew up. So I'm just going to pop that on the screen. Hopefully you can all see it now. I'm just going to expand my view so I can still see all your faces. So this is a document that my team and I prepared that looks at all of the previous planning efforts and calls forth. It's organized in terms of the general organization of your bylaws overall. So we've taken everything that came from the zoning audit, the housing production plan, and the master plan. And said, okay, what did these three documents recommend as changes? Some of them are very technical. Some of them have broader implications. And so you'll see there's a couple of high-level things like amending the districts to allow or improve the variety of housing options. As we go further, we're going to see that there's a number of different options, which was part of the first public meeting that we had. Amending the institutional overlay district came out, thinking about district bounding lines. Some of these are a little bit technical in terms like the lots that are split, removal of sod, things like that. I think where it starts to get interesting as we start thinking about how non-conforming uses are addressed by the bylaws. And this is actually one of the things I was interested to hear from you all, given your experience in terms of needing variances for these non-conforming structures, non-conforming single and two-family residential structures. Some of this is just bringing things into best practices, and I'm happy to jump back to any of these pages as we go through. Thinking about the dimensional requirements and should those be changed, the bylaw. The housing production plan suggested, for example, downsizing the minimum square foot requirement. That becomes actually really interesting as we think of older neighborhoods. This is something that's found very commonly, and you had mentioned transitioning from a farming community to more of a suburban community rather than a rural one. Certainly in areas where buildings were or neighborhoods were developed prior to zoning coming in, kind of the 1920s to 1950s, so anything earlier than that, we often find that the dimensional requirements don't match what's on the ground now. So I was interested to see this suggestion from the HPP, and that'd be part of the analysis that we look at. Some of this is changing language, adding things like barriers or buffers for residential abutters in the business and light industry districts. Some of these came out of the zoning audit that looked at it. Landscaping and performance standards. So, again, those components that might address some of the things that you or the planning board see. And then as we get into the special regulations, you'll see there's some requirements or some thoughts about modifying some of the language around driveways, industrial plans, approved street plans, so site plan review or special permit requirements. Thinking now, this section 7 is where it starts to get interesting and where you see a little bit of potential overlap with the MBTA Communities Act. So our first public meeting was on housing, specifically to address the housing-related recommendations in the overall zoning and the housing-related requirements for the MBTA Communities Act. So seeing that the Housing Production Plan recommended exploring a range of as of right housing types, and obviously that tailors very nicely with the MBTA Communities Act. But in the housing plan, the master plan, this idea of other types of housing, shared living, I will show you the slides on that, cottage style housing, village style, and then of course the multifamily, which again overlaps with the MBTA Communities Act. This 7.17, the idea that proposed multifamily or attached dwelling needs to be served by water and sewer systems. So having that come closer to existing infrastructure or potential new infrastructure, accessory dwelling units, conversion of single family dwelling. A lot of these are coming out of either the zoning audit or the HPP, but again, could overlap with the MBTA communities strategy. We also have some other special district regulations. So thinking of a scenic overlay district, which I know is something that I've talked about with some of the rural communities I've worked in. So I was interested to see it here. FEMA model floodplains. I've seen those overlay districts in more and more towns recently. So I'm certainly interested to see if you've had anything come up in a floodplain that you were concerned about. And then thinking about, again, some more of the more technical administrative procedures around site plan review and other requirements. And then looking at the Chapter 40R, identifying areas for the smart growth overlay. So this is a little bit outside what we've talked about in terms of existing, but there were some things that came up that were, thinking about the subsidized housing inventory and how the town could progress towards that. So these are not necessarily immediate zoning specific recommendations, but ones that came out of the plans that might have a zoning component to it. Thinking about I thought this was a really interesting one here, using the health assessment tool in planning and design decisions. Public health is something that's even pre-pandemic was coming into planning quite a bit. It was interesting to see this recommended as a potential idea around zoning. The same thing for equitable planning in terms of how communities have developed over time. So again, this page is really about those zoning related or ideas that came out of these documents. So I'll stop there for a minute so that we can react. I'm happy to bring this back. It's nice to see everybody's faces. Happy to bring it back up if there's a particular area that you wanted to talk about. But Craig, with you having been on the zoning audit committee, I'd be interested in your thoughts relative to that as well. As I said, that was a primary document that we went through as we pulled this together.
I wasn't on this audit committee.
Oh,
I've
I'm
been on it
sorry.
in
I
the
misunderstood
past.
you. Okay.
Yeah, no,
Sorry.
I try to stay away from policy making decisions where we're an administrative board.
Fair enough. That makes sense. So that's the
So-
overall. Sorry, go ahead, Rich.
So Emily, I have a question then. So as
Sure.
you're going through this, and I'm presuming that we're not your first client, that you deal with a variety of cities and towns of different demographics and different sizes and populations and so on and so forth, right? And so based on what you have sifted through in terms of our bylaws and looking at comparable communities such as Middleton, Middleton at one point a farming town, now becoming a bedroom community where a lot of professionals are moving, and we have some sections of Middleton that have mega houses and all this other stuff. So looking at a comparable community, right? How do the Middleton bylaws, zoning bylaw, compare to others? Are we in line? Are we out in left field? I mean, how do we stack up with other communities? And not that the other communities are, and maybe I should rephrase my question, other communities that may be of comparable size that really have it together. Are we with them? Are we halfway between? Are we have a lot of work to do? I mean, what is your assessment?
So I don't normally rank the communities against each other. You're right. Right. I work in a wide variety of communities. So I work with gateway cities. I've got 2 clients now. One of them is a zoning client where the zoning that we're doing came out of the comprehensive plan that we just finished. There are about 1,500 people, so slightly smaller. So I think where I try and look is what is it that the community is trying to achieve, and how close is the zoning to what they're trying to achieve. So the idea that you're working with a project that you feel, or at least, and you mentioned you don't quite have the tools that you need to be able to deal with that. That's an important signal to me to say, my next question is, what tools would be more helpful? I'm working with a community now that has a similar thing. We're actually doing their comprehensive plan, which has a zoning focus to it. And then in the middle of this process, they just got the potential for a very large development, larger than that community has ever seen before. And they're running into that same thing. We don't have the tools to deal with this. Well, the tools they need may be different from the tools that you need. So it's trying to find out what those are. So Rich, I would say that there's some things that might be missing from your zoning. There are some things that are clearly coming out of the conversation. Again, pointing and your comment about the house is too big, but people can't downsize and stay in the community because the housing type isn't there. That's something I am seeing is very common among communities, but what the housing type is that would solve that need is going to vary by the type of community. And I think particularly for a community that is experiencing that transition from definitely rural to something else, whether it's suburban or bedroom, or continues to have components of the rural and wants to keep those, but also recognizes that there's some need for change beyond that development pattern. That also is a common factor or a common thing that towns in Massachusetts are going through. And so I think we can start to look, Rich, to your thought about who might be a few steps ahead that we can look at to precedents for that.
Yeah. And I mean, and the other follow on to that question is, and I heard what you said, what do we want? Yeah. And, sometimes we may not necessarily know what we want or which questions to ask or how to actually craft this document in such a way, which is why we look to someone like you who says, hey, you don't want to put your hand on a burning stove or on a hot stove. You're going to burn your hand, and looking for that guidance that says, you have these things, or you in your bylaws, or you would like these things in your bylaws. And based on my experience at Innes Associates, we've seen other communities do that, and it hasn't resulted in the outcome they're looking for. That's the kind of question I'm looking at. And again, we have members who have been on the ZBA in Middleton for a while, or have come from other communities and moved to Middleton and have been volunteering on either the ZBA or planning board or things like that. I mean, the other thing that's interesting, in some communities, the planning board handles site plan review.
Yes,
right?
that's
Whereas in
true.
Middleton, the ZBA handles site plan review. There's a lot of things that can go into site plan. I mean, we've just started more robustly getting peer reviews for things like traffic and things like that. Again, I'm in the business. Another member, Bill Renault, he's the town engineer in Wakefield, professional engineer. We have some expertise. Craig has a law background. Ian LeBlanc is an architect. I mean, we have a good, broad cross-section of talent on our board. And so we're equipped to look at things like site plan, but sometimes to get in the weeds, we need someone else, outside consultant, to provide an unbiased opinion of something, right? And so there's all of those, all of these things that are sort of out there, that we have these challenges. And now we're getting projects like the Angelica's one, but there are others. We have one that's right on the North Andover town line that we have issues over water. Like, where's the water coming from, right? And how are we going to deal with that? There's an intersection in North Andover that's close by that has a high crash rate. How do we deal with that sort of intermunicipal cooperation to make sure that the project, while North Andover may love it, we end up getting stuck with the residuals, that kind of a thing. So there's a lot going on, even in a small community like Middleton. And that's why I asked that question. I think we were looking not only for your analysis of where we are, based on the slides that you just had up there, but what is your recommendation? Not necessarily we're going to take every recommendation, but we should at least hear what someone in your field who does this every day may be proposing. So that's kind of where I was at.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So just a couple of things on them. So I'm still in the information gathering phase, right? So we've gathered this list. We're talking to the public, talking to yourselves, talking to Mr. Fitzgerald. And then after that, I'll be starting to pull together the initial drafts that say, based on what I've heard, based on what I've read, based on what I've seen in other communities, we think that, you should be looking at these components. Had we started off this conversation and you said, oh my God, I'm so glad that we started off this way, because we have this one neighborhood where, the setbacks are such that every single homeowner who comes in wanting to fix their front porch has to get a variance because they're all, 2 feet into the setback. We'd be having a different conversation, then I'd like, oh, I need to look at that. Telling me that you need help with tools or with a process or something like that for an intermunicipal conversation, that's really important. If you'd said that it would be great with site plan review if we had some sort of design guidelines or development standards beyond what we have already, that also gives me a direction. So that's one of the reasons for starting the conversation with just hearing what your experience, good and bad, has been with the work that you have in front of us. So, or in front of you.
One other comment I want to make, Emily, as well, is, with any document, whether it's the zoning bylaw, whether if it's a town has a traffic ordinance, whatever it might be, is ambiguities in the document.
Yes.
Something that someone can hang their hat on, that afterwards we're like, oh man, that's really not the way we want this thing to go. But the way it's written, you could take it either way, and that sort of thing. And so it's a question of eliminating those ambiguities. The other thing I know a lot of communities have in their site plan review. I was a conservation commissioner for 13 years. And in Danvers, I represented the Concom on the Balanced Growth Committee, and there was a lot of discussion about green space, in terms of percent green space versus, impervious area, those sorts of things. Well, what makes sense?
Right.
We don't
Yeah.
want a project that's all asphalt. We want something that looks nice, that is going to be environmentally pleasing to the community, and provide, reduce the footprint and all these other things that are in there. And I know those are some of the things that are in the weeds, but certainly there should be some guidance so that when we're looking at something, we can at least go to the document and say, hey, this makes sense, and gives us a little, I don't want to say, it's a word I'm trying to look for. Guidance. I'll use guidance, right? I don't want to go beyond that, but
So it's a great thing to
that was
bring,
kind of my
yeah.
2 cents.
Yeah, no, and that's a good thing to bring up. When I think of development standards for site plan review, it is something that's measurable, it's quantifiable. It is not the building should be attractive, right? The building should be attractive is not a helpful statement for anybody, because then you've got 6 meetings on what attractive is, means. But saying that we
Pepto-Bismol
should
pink.
have,
We like buildings in Pepto-Bismol pink versus someone else likes them in blue, right?
well, it's, the ground floor should be transparent versus the ground floor should have, between 60 and 70% windows, or the windows should be between 4 feet off the ground and 8 feet off the ground. This is for a storefront, obviously, right? One says, give us some windows, and they should have a lot of transparency, and the other says how much or how wide or how tall. So managing X amount of stormwater on site, right? Rather than you should address your stormwater versus you should manage, 90% or 100% of your stormwater on site. That's the second is much more useful in site plan review. Can you check the box? And in some cases, one community I was working with has gone for certain types of projects for administrative site plan review up to a certain threshold. And so, if we started off the conversation and you said, hey, we're spending, 2 nights a week going through site plan review projects, we'd like to reduce our load a little bit, or, even 2 nights per month, whatever that is, then we could talk about strategies to streamline the projects so that you got the ones that required the most input. That is a possibility. So now I'm not making recommendations, but I'm hoping I'm giving you some ideas of how the conversation might go. So I do want to check, because we're a little bit over half an hour now from when we actually, started talking. And so I do want to make sure we covered the MBTA. I think I'm the only item on your agenda, but I'm also sure you don't want to be here till, 11 o'clock at night.
No.
So, okay.
We're gonna get to
That's
see
fine.
each other again on Thursday. So yeah, so let's we'll try and keep it to an hour if we can. How's that?
Okay, fair enough. So I'll just, why don't I switch over to the MBTA Communities Act, so you can see kind of where that is and what we're talking about with that. And then we can come back and finish off the whole conversation. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay, great. I'll just pull that up. Few seconds. So I'm actually going to show you a little bit of what we talked about with the public at our first meeting, which was November 14th, I believe. So we had started off with just a definition of the different types of housing that were mentioned in these 3 different plans that could be added to the zoning bylaws. So I just had the definitions up. Some of these could work with the MBTA Communities Act strategy. Some of these wouldn't. So for example, the shared living, the ADUs would not, the co-living maybe, the conversion, the cottage style housing, depending on whether or not this was a single lot versus multiple lots, and whether those were triplexes or duplexes. But the key thing for the MBTA Communities Act is this idea of what is multifamily. And so the definition is that from section 3A, which is the new law, is that multifamily housing means a building with 3 or more dwelling units, or 2 or more buildings on the same lot with more than 1 residential dwelling unit per building. So in other words, your minimum is either going to be a three family or 3 townhouse on a single lot, or it's going to be 2 duplexes. That's the smallest amount. And so we've been talking a lot with communities about this idea of missing middle housing, which is something that's been popular in planning circles. And to your point about the places to go when you downsize, the missing middle housing is quite often that thing that's not in the community. That people might find attractive. A lot of communities have the single family homes. Many of the larger communities or the communities that maybe have a highway border are seeing those mid-rise. Obviously, the big cities have the high-rise, but these pieces in between that are usually somewhere on the order of 6 to 12, 8 to 20 units are missing from our communities. So one of the questions I tend to have for the communities I'm working with is, where do you fit on this strategy? What are your needs in terms of the types of housing that you had, especially when we're thinking about missing middle? So these 3 maps were really just talking, the one on the far left here is the types of housing that you already have in town. So you have single family residential, you have 2 and 3, you have some condominiums, some apartments of 4 to 8, or even a very few with 8 plus. So we wanted to talk to people about not where housing is zoned for in this map, but where it already exists. And this was taken from your zoning, from your assessor's data. In the middle, of course, is your zoning map, which you recognize. So we were talking about where it exists versus where it's allowed. And then on the far right is a parcel scoring map that we've been doing. And we've been taking the criteria of walkable communities and thinking about, okay, how does every single parcel rate in terms of walkability to different uses? I didn't put up the list, but I could certainly get it for you. And where does Middleton rate on that? So we talk about proximity to schools, proximity to shopping, proximity to services, proximity to transit. Run these all through and create a heat map. And basically, the hotter the color, so the red, the more walkable, the cooler the color, the green, the less walkable. And given the amount of, open forested land that you have, this should not be a surprise as a map. But we use that to start conversations about where housing should be with the community. So, and that's where we got from, this is what you currently have in terms of zoning. What could or should you have based on not just the MBTA Communities Act, but the overall housing need of the communities? And I'd like to say that the way that I've certainly been approaching working with communities on the MBTA Communities Act is really about, what is it that that community needs? Now, how does this requirement, this law, help you get to where you need to be? So let's talk a little bit about what the MBTA Communities Act is. How many of you are familiar with it? Or reasonably familiar? Okay. See one hand.
Vaguely.
Vaguely. Okay, so I'll start from the beginning. That's fine. Most people are in the same boat. So it is a new law, requires that each of the 177 MBTA communities do 4 things. They have to provide for one district, at least one district of reasonable size, in which multifamily housing is permitted as of right. That district cannot have age restrictions on the housing, and the housing shall be suitable for families with children, must have a minimum gross density of 15 units, 15 dwelling units per acre. And if you are a transit community, you actually have a station, then part of the district has to be within 0.5 miles from that transit station. Critical
Can I ask a quick question? Okay.
Sure.
So, because I do know that this has been a controversial subject too. What designates an MBTA community? I see MGL chapter 161A section 1. So, all
Right
right,
here.
I'm stealing your thunder.
Yep.
All right, sorry.
That's fine. I can jump around. No worries on that. So these are how they were designated. So the 14 in cities and towns that were the first MBTA communities, and there were 51 cities and towns that hosted them later. Then there are the served communities that abut the city or town, and then anything that's been added. Interestingly enough, it was 175 communities when the law was first passed, and then Fall River and New Bedford came online because of South Coast Rail. So that's why it's now 177. And you can see that there's just a couple of communities that are Boston just doesn't apply to Boston. because Boston is Boston. And you can see there's a couple of other communities that are kind of cut out, but it covers pretty much the eastern half of the state in terms of its reach.
And it's regardless
Yeah.
of what level of MBTA service a community receives.
So it is in terms of being designated MBTA community, but as we'll see in a moment, your level of service determines when you have to become compliant. So I'll just note that the reason the law was passed is we've got a housing shortage, and you can see that in the news every single day. Our housing is not affordable to everybody, and the Massachusetts is starting to become less competitive for jobs, talent, businesses, because we don't have the housing to support people. So critical to know what it's not. This is not a mandate to build housing. In other words, they are telling towns, the state is telling the towns, you need to zone for it, but we are not expecting you, the town, to build the housing. That's anticipated to be the private market in response to zoning, the way any zoning would be. It's also not saying we're holding you responsible for the estimated capacity that is calculated to show that you're compliant. So you're not being given a number and being told that you have to produce that many houses. It's not restricted to affordable housing. I've had a couple of communities that have been upset about that because they really need affordable housing. It's also not a one-size-fits-all tool for the communities. This isn't going to solve communities with significant affordability needs or a significant underhoused population. It's really aimed at the market rate to workforce housing ranges of housing needs. And it's not viewed as optional. We've heard that several different times. So Middleton's an adjacent community. I mentioned the type of community, and here's the map that shows what's what, with the dark blue being the rapid transit communities. The teal are the commuter rail, and the green, like yourselves, are the adjacent communities. So the rapid transit communities must be in compliance by the end of this month. So they're kind of under the wire. Commuter rail communities and adjacent communities, it's December 31st of next year, and the adjacent small towns, it's December 31st of 2025. And the adjacent small towns also tend to be the ones with the fewest planning resources in general, so they get a little bit longer to comply with the requirements. Implications that the town does not comply. So, top of the line for me, because planner, is that this really gives any town who has to comply the opportunity to have a serious discussion of their housing needs and how the act can help them strategize to meet those housing needs. And so, I think of it as a loss of communities that are dubious about compliance, I think it's really a loss of the opportunity to have that conversation. However, there are some sticks. The law itself restricts access to grant funds for the Housing Choice Initiative, local capital projects, and MassWorks infrastructure, which is a big one for many communities if there are no compliance. HLC, the former Department of Housing and Community Development, which is now the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, added some 13 additional grant programs that would be at risk. And then the Attorney General distributed a letter in March of this year saying that all MBTA communities must comply with the law. It's not viewed as something optional. So those are the sticks.
Well, there's some on there like brownfields and things like that. I mean, to me, that's okay. I mean, we're cleaning up environmental issues and they're gonna nix those kinds of things. I'm not quite sure what the thought process was on some of these.
I'm just giving you the list. Yeah, I wasn't involved in the conversations.
Don't shoot the messenger. I get it.
Exactly. Not my fault. So I mentioned that there are multiple tools, and we've put this up here because a lot of people have asked about extremely low income. The MBTA Communities Act does allow you to do some affordable housing, but there are some restrictions around that in terms of the level. So it's really at the moderate income or the workforce or the market rate that it is a helpful solution. It's also, we mentioned it's not housing production. I think those of you who are familiar with the development process probably already know this, that zoning doesn't automatically produce housing. There are many other factors, and this is really important in those communities that are looking to this as a solution to a housing problem and do want to have housing production. It's thinking about what other things in the community might be a barrier. Obviously, interest rates recently have been a barrier to any sort of construction. So we're seeing that, but a community has to have developable sites, the labor has to be available, the financing has to be available, the strength of the market has to be there. So there's a lot that goes into producing the housing. The zoning is really the first step. So I've got a bunch of common questions, but we can jump forward depending on, your questions about this. Maybe that's the easiest way to say is stop here for a little bit. And then I'd like to talk to you about the requirements for what we need to know in order to calculate or to figure out whether or not you're compliant. But let's take a breath and see if you have any more initial questions before we get there.
Let's go. Craig, anything?
No, this is very informative.
Okay.
Great.
How about you, Ann? No?
Yeah,
Okay.
I agree with Craig. I'm absorbing. It's
Right.
really interesting.
So I'm never at a loss of questions, Emily. So I do have one, and well, I have a
Sure.
few, but one in particular, as I'm looking through this, in particular, was the slide where you can you back up one slide?
Sure.
I think it's one right here.
Yeah.
Factors. Okay, so in the previous slide that said that all of the grant programs that were at risk, right? And so, and again, this is just sort of something I'm thinking about as we're going through this and where we're trying to increase housing, right?
Right.
In a community, and not recognizing, some of these factors that we see right here: market strength and financial feasibility and developable sites. But in Middleton, for example, the availability of infrastructure, water, for example, the impact where this is not age-restricted living, it's for children as well. And what is the impact on schools and things like that? Are we going to have to build a new school now? Because it becomes a domino effect, right? We're going to add more housing, which we should, but it's not like we're just going to add more housing and that's great and we just kind of go on our merry way. We're going to add more housing, so that's more infrastructure. That's more desks at the school. There's all of those things. And again, you haven't done this, you're just giving this. These are just thoughts that go through my head. When the legislators put this stuff together, are they thinking of that? And are they ready to provide additional assistance to those communities that are going to need this to make this a success, I guess, is my question. And I don't know if you've got this question from other communities as well. And if you did, I'd like to hear how we're going to solve that.
Well, what is my answer? So first of all, yes, of course, your questions are not uncommon questions, and they're good questions. So in terms of infrastructure, here's where we get to production versus zoning, right? So right now, we're just talking about taking that first step and zoning, creating the zoning that would allow for housing to happen. The act doesn't give us room to consider infrastructure, right? But the planning process does. So one of the things that we should be talking about as part of Middleton's strategy is where in town does it make sense to have this? And is this an area that has any sort of existing infrastructure from roads on up, right? To water, to sewer? Is it an area where there could be infrastructure? So for example, if a developer came in and said, I'd like to put in, whether it's a group septic system, all the way up to a package treatment plant, Title V does allow for some alternatives. And I'll say that's as much as I know because not a wastewater engineer of any sort, but I do know that they have different options, different test things. Never give advice on things that you don't know that much about, but just calling it out. But none of that is zoning related, right? Is the idea that we should plan for the best places, but if somebody comes in and says, well, I'd like to build this and the infrastructure isn't there, it's not in the zoning that the town has to provide that infrastructure, right? That's either the town comes to some sort of agreement to expand something in those towns that have that infrastructure available, or the developer is doing that on their own dime, and they have to consider how that does with how that works with their profits. So that's the infrastructure side of it. So you, the town, are not obligated to extend sewer, or extend water, or extend roads solely so that something could be developed in a particular area. In terms of school children, that becomes a very interesting question. And certainly in typical multifamily, those higher density apartments, those don't tend to appeal to families. And so the number of children at desks historically has been relatively low. I'm not saying that there's zero, because there's never zero, but it is much lower generally than the number of units. And there have been studies out there that housing specialists have done to understand what the impact is on schools. Were you to do more of the cluster housing, that would possibly tick up some. But in general, and I don't know of any studies specific to cluster style housing. I'm more familiar with the ones on the more dense multifamily. So, but yes, again, it becomes a decision. Some of the towns that I'm working with, actually, their school systems are under threat, because they don't have enough young families moving into the town. The populations, these obviously tend to be smaller towns further away, but the populations are aging such that their school systems actually have a decline in enrollment. So again, it does come back to what's important to each community, and that's part of the reason that we're working together and having public engagement on this.
And that's just I mean, I mentioned schools, but there's other town or city services, whether it's police and fire. And you may know,
Yep.
the former Roe Quarry in Revere on the Revere Malden line. That development built a new fire station. One half of the building is Malden Fire, the other half is Revere Fire. Again, but it's
that's awesome.
Yeah, it's all of these other, it's just all of these other things to be considered. And I
Right.
agree that, the town would not be obligated to provide this infrastructure, but oftentimes based on what's in the bylaw, right? It's almost an as of right, we can come in and do this. I suppose we can turn around and say, well, yeah, you can do this, but unless you can service it with the appropriate infrastructure, then, you can't.
Well, that's a really interesting point. And I have had this question before. Actually, I've got it up here. Where did it go? So presence of infrastructure. But this paragraph down at the bottom is the most important, which is if you're an applicant to do a development, you have to meet requirements that are outside of zoning. So the zoning doesn't trump the building code. It doesn't trump Board of Health regulations. It doesn't trump the Conservation Commission. So they still have to meet those requirements. And so although this is as of right zoning with site plan review being kind of the level of control that you would do in other communities, as you mentioned, planning board, it doesn't mean that that's the only level of review. And I think that's important for people to understand. If you have an MS4 permit for stormwater management, for those communities that have that Title V, they still have to meet. In other words, they can't come and say, well, we're going to build this and we're not going to provide any sort of wastewater treatment, right? They still have to do that. And I think some people that I've encountered have forgotten that zoning is not your only control over development. And so it's one of the reasons we talk about that. So, well, let me talk a little bit about what you're required to do, and then we can jump back if we need to. So there's three things that we look at: the land area, so the geographic area, capacity, and zoning. And so the land area is really we'll talk about it a little bit. The geographic district or districts, you can use more than one of those. The capacity is the number of dwelling units that you need to demonstrate that the zoning will allow you to do. So the unit capacity and the zoning obviously is the zoning. What's interesting about these is how they work together. So if you change the geography, if you expand the district, if you narrow the district, if you put the district in different places within town, that's going to start changing the unit capacity, how many units you can get for each district. Important thing to note here is that you need to do an average of 15 units per acre. If you have more than one district, it allows you to have some areas with higher density, some areas of lower density, as long as they average out to 15 units per acre. So some communities have found this to be a useful strategy of thinking where would we be happy to see kind of an increase from what's there now, but maybe not as much as 15 units per acre. And we have another area where we can do more and average the two together. The zoning, through its requirements of dimensional standards, helps, is applied to the land to help understand how many units can be produced. So you have a minimum land area of 50 acres. You don't have a station, so none of it has to be within the station area. And you have to have, as with everybody else, a minimum contiguous district size of 50% of the total district size. So if you only had a district of 50 acres, it would be 25 acres. If you had a greater area, quite frequently people or communities are doing that because they want to drop the density a little bit. Again, working with the averages. So say you had a 60-acre district, then your minimum contiguous district size would be 30 acres. And that just means that all the parcels are contiguous to each other. It's also important to know that you can't have any single acre of less than, or any single district of less than 5 acres. You have a minimum unit capacity of 750. So you're trying to find zoning that will allow you to zone for a capacity of 750 units. Again, production just depends on whether or not the private market comes forward to do that. And then in terms of zoning requirements, I've put up the types of requirements you might have. Those ones in red are the ones that the compliance model looks at. So there are two ways that you demonstrate compliance. One is by submitting the zoning to HLC, and with that you submit a compliance model that takes the geography in terms of the whole district area and all the parcels within it, and the zoning parameters, which you see, some of which you see are here, are applied to that geography on a parcel by parcel basis. That calculates your unit capacity. If you're over your 50 acres, if your geography is right, and you're over your 750 units in terms of unit capacity, you're over your 15 dwelling units per acre, then you are compliant, and you've demonstrated that with those two documents.
Emily, how did they develop the metrics in that previous slide, 50 acres and all that?
So that came from HLC. There, if you go to the website for the Communities Act, there's a bunch of documents that are useful. One of them is the compliance guidelines, and that has the exact calculations that they use. I used to have them on the slides, but people just started getting confused because
that's
like
fine.
if this and that, but they're all there.
Okay, I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, it's those compliance guidelines are very useful. That website also has a number of other resources that you can look at, including the compliance model and the how-to for the compliance model. And then, so that's where we are. We've just to sort of wrap that up, we're working to identify 3 districts to test for the compliance. We have the community meeting, so we're pulling those pieces together. We'll test them with different dimensional standards to see what works and come back to the community and say, this is what the 3 scenarios look like. What do you think? In the meantime, starting in January, after our conversation, the other conversations I'm having this month, we'll be starting to draft the bylaw amendments so that people can start to see what they're looking at and react to them and our recommendations. We're going to have an amendment discussion at our next public meeting. Haven't yet set the date, but that's the amendments related to the non-residential uses. So commercial and industrial, and then anything that's not included in that first meeting, and a continued discussion for the MBTA Communities Act. So that's really where we are right now.
The important part will be the siting of the Middleton Rapid Transit Station. Right? We'll have to figure out what that's going to be. Right. So,
well, if you've got any, suggestions, just let me know. But that possibly is outwith my area of responsibility. So zoning districts I can help you with. Citing a transit station, not so much.
Members, any question for Emily on what we've heard thus far? It's been very informative. Craig, anything?
No, I think that was helpful. I'll be curious to see how, no matter what is zoned or what area is zoned, how the rest of the technical requirements to actually build in those zones are going to be met. Because I don't know where we're going to find land in Middleton that can support 15 units per acre for 50 acres. Because
Yeah.
that's what the 750 is. The 750 is we got those 50 acres have to hold 15 dwelling units per acre.
Right.
And we just found out that, you know, that's basically the bare minimum of the Angelica's property, essentially, is, you know, they're at 60 units for what was essentially a 5-acre property to begin with. So, and that was maxed out on its requirements. So,
And again, it gets down to that infrastructure supporting it, right?
Right.
That was yeah.
we can put it wherever you want. Unless someone's running a pipe through, you're not going to be able to support it in town. But
And you know what's interesting to me
Yeah.
is MassWorks. Prior to MassWorks was actually a conglomeration of a bunch of other funding programs, one of which used to be PWED, Public Works Economic Development, which is now part of MassWorks. Yet, if this thing, you know, and again, those are the kinds of funding programs that supported things like that. But if you're not going to be able to do certain things, then you're not eligible for this fund. It's just, I don't know. Some of it just seems a little, I don't know.
I think what's interesting about that is, and boy, I haven't heard the word PWED in a while now. It's those grants are already competitive. MassWorks was tied during the Baker administration to housing. So if you had a grant that was housing related, you had a higher sort of level of competitiveness to somebody who didn't. I think with the addition of are you compliant, it will become even more competitive at that point for these grants. So, whether or not it ends up being it looks like for the ones in 3A, so that were specifically mentioned in the legislation, it certainly is a requirement. Whether or not it's something that is given consideration on those other lists of grants, it certainly will be looked at. The willingness of a town to comply and their ability to comply or certainly going to be looked at for those grants, and that's something to consider. I did have
I'm involved
somebody
in
tell me about, yeah,
and
so good.
I'm involved in 4 MassWorks projects right now. 1 completed, 3 of them underway in Lynn. And one is where the former flea market was on the Lynnway, 550 units. But again, Lynn is a lot different than a community like Middleton. And to Craig's point, where are you going to find this? Where are you going to find this 50 acres that you can do, that many units per acre? I think it's going to be
of family units too. So these are not. This is not 750 studio units. This is like 750 minimum 2, if not 3 bedroom units as are required for family dwelling units in Massachusetts. So the number of bedrooms that those properties would have to support isn't just 750 studios. It's 750 minimum, say 2 bedrooms, which is going to be
actually, Craig, not to interrupt, but just to let you know, your zoning cannot mandate the number of bedrooms in either direction. So
no, I'm not mandating. I'm not saying that's what's mandated. I'm saying for like affordable housing in Massachusetts, there needs to be a certain number of family units, and they typically characterize family units as 2 to 3 bedrooms, correct?
Right, but what I'm saying here is that the law the zoning can't preclude family units. It's not requiring a specific number. So those 750 units or whatever actually gets built can still be a mix of studio 1, 2, and 3. It's just that your bylaws can't say, hey, you can only develop two bedrooms, or you can only develop 1 bedroom.
No,
So in other
right.
words,
I'm just going off what the state considers family housing to be.
right. I'm just saying that it doesn't have to. You were saying that all 750 units could be 2 or 3, and that's true, they could be, but they don't have to be, is what I'm saying. So a developer could come in and say, I see your as of right zoning. I see that it allows 3 bedrooms. I would rather have a mix of 1 and 2s. The very next developer could come in and say, hey, I'd rather have 2s and 3s. So it's not, there's nothing in the zoning that's going to say that they have to do one or the other. It's just you can't put something in the zoning that says you can't do family units, or you can only do age-restricted units.
And you know, again, I keep getting back to this infrastructure thing, right? I
Right.
mean, a community that doesn't have a sewer system and a treatment system, right? These are all, like you said, either package plants or massive septic systems and all this other stuff. You know, I mean, it'd be one thing if, you know, there's everything was going to the South Essex Storage District, but
Right.
it's not. You know what I mean? So, yeah, it's some challenges for sure.
Yeah, a lot of the adjacent towns and the adjacent small towns, my understanding is most, I don't have an exact number. So my understanding though is most of those are septic-based towns. So yeah, this is a common problem. It's a common question.
Yeah.
So, and
Well,
there's other factors to go into that.
it's about 8:40. I don't know if there was anything else, Emily, that you wanted to share with us tonight, or if the members have any other questions, anything from Ian or Craig or poor Ian. I sent her a note and said, if you had a question, put it in the chat, but at
Oh, I
least she
see
was
it,
able
yeah.
to listen. At
Yeah.
least she was able to listen.
I do have a
I,
question.
yeah,
Oh,
go
a
ahead.
quick question. So it kind of with regard to what Craig was talking about, this new law is not the same as low income housing, and this is not correct. This is just housing. So,
This is,
okay. I mean, you were being kind of clear, but I was just not quite sure I was understanding. Okay. So if they wanted to build all 1 and 2 bedroom apartments somewhere,
mhm,
that would accommodate the law. That would, right? Okay.
right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and they could be at market rate,
Yeah.
correct?
Oh,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah. So let me talk a little bit about the affordability, just to let you know, because that's possibly been one. There's a couple of sort of very, very common pieces of misinformation out there. You'll see it in the newspapers or whatever, and the affordability level is one of those. So you can set a requirement for affordable housing. They can't exceed 10% of the total units offered, and it has to be offered at no less than 80% of the area median income. If you want to go above that, so some towns already have, for example, inclusionary zoning in place. That's like a 15%, or in some places even a 20% requirement. Or you might have a town that's been having issues with affordability, and so they go deeper. They might have a 60% AMI or something like that. You have to do an economic feasibility analysis to show to HLC that your town could legitimately produce housing at those deeper affordability levels or at that greater requirement. Otherwise, you're limited to, the 10%, 80% rule, as I've been calling it. And so, and to your point, these could be 100% market rate units if that's the way the town wants to go, or a limited level of affordability. I do have some towns that are creating a bonus incentive for deeper affordability, so that they're complying at that 80%, 10% rule, but maybe they want a 60%, 20%. So they're offering like an extra story of height or a waiver on parking or something to create a deeper incentive for that affordability. But obviously that again is on a community by community basis and just, what they're looking for. So, but I think that's the biggest one. Is certainly early on, there was a huge assumption that this was only affordable housing, and that is not in fact correct. So,
Awesome.
yeah.
Well, Emily, I think tonight was very informative. We appreciate you coming and joining us. I'm presuming that the slides will be available to the members, and this was being recorded for those members who couldn't join tonight, and they can listen in. It looks like Katrina dropped off. She's dealing with some family things. We wish and hope her the best with that. But unless members have any other questions or comments, we'll adjourn. And again, thank you so much for all the information. It was very helpful.
Well, my pleasure. And if you have additional questions, I found all of your questions very helpful to me because it helps me anticipate what the public will want. But if you have any other questions, please feed them back through to me, and I hope to see you at the public meeting. And then once we do have draft recommendations, if you're interested, I'd be happy to swing back by. But just having the initial conversation with you is helpful. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And members, we'll see you Thursday.